Okay, and now we pretend like we're saying hi for the first time again.
Okay, hi.
Hi, how are you?
I'm doing well.
Yeah, good. For everybody who is unaware, this is Lisa Neher. I think I got that right.
Yeah.
Singer, composer, all around great person.
Aw.
I think the best place to start is at the beginning. So, what is your earliest musical memory?
Oh, wow. I mean, for me, it's a lot of like running around in the backyard pretending to be like Tolkien characters or Kirk and Spock or Luke and Leia or some mashup of those and like humming my own soundtracks. Like
Interesting.
there was always like background music going on in my head and in my mouth and in my throat. So that's a pretty early memory. Another early memory for me would be my Uncle Dan's wedding. I think I was a flower girl and I must have been like 4 maybe.
Yeah.
And I remember my aunt saying, I think she sang Ave Maria, um, and just being like, oh my gosh, Rose sounds amazing. And she did. She was like a big choral singer in high school. And I don't know if she did it in college or not because she was in nursing and that's pretty intense. But
Right.
that's a big memory of mine too, is it's kind of one of those faint childhood memories. But yeah.
That's fair. And you grew up in Portland, I think I have that right.
Oh, actually, I grew up south of Seattle in this town called Kent, Covington. Covington used to be like a unincorporated, so southeast of Seattle in the
Mm,
suburbs. And then I came to Portland for my undergrad at Lewis and Clark
I
College.
see.
So Portland is like my second, it's where I grew up as an adult, I guess, right? In undergrad, you kind of have another sense of growing up
I
somewhere.
gotcha.
hmm
Did they have a like school music programs where you were, or
Well, so here's interesting. I was homeschooled.
okay?
And so there was probably school music. I'm sure. I think Kent has actually pretty good schools. Excuse me, I'm having a little bit of allergies.
Yeah, it's a bad day today.
Um, yeah, and I started allergy drops recently. I'm just gonna suck on a
Yeah,
cough
sure.
drop here. um, so I'm sure they had music going on. It was probably great. But I wasn't involved in it. I did get involved in the junior high and high school musicals, which were considered extracurriculars.
Gotcha.
And so in Washington State, what's really awesome is everyone pays education taxes. So homeschool families, they have the access to, oh goodness, this is embarrassing. It has not been a problem like this all day. Um, as a homeschool family, you have access to any of the extracurriculars
Mm,
that you want. Or you can go in and take a class or 2 classes or whatever and just not be somebody who's working towards your diploma.
hmm
So I made use of that the minute I got excited about drama and was involved in the musicals in junior high and high school. And that was how I got involved in like school music, was through musicals.
Okay. And you learned music from your parents or from private instructors who were brought in from other
Both. So
places? Both?
I took piano lessons from a neighborhood teacher, a wonderful woman named Mary Ballstad, and then Lori Shannon, who was another kind of like local private teacher.
Mm,
And I took piano lessons and then just a few voice lessons to help with musicals, but I didn't do voice lessons till college on a regular basis.
okay. Interesting.
hmm
So, like, I'm skipping ahead a little bit, but all of your like undergrad, master's, DMA has a very heavy theater emphasis. It seems like
hmm
you, Lewis and Clark, you got voice, composition, and theater.
hmm
University of Kansas, I know, is a big musical theater place. I think.
Yeah, and my degree from UK, University of Kansas, is actually composition.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, so like this is welcome to the crazy weird world that is Lisa's CV, which is like always like some weird combination of things that doesn't quite uh it's not quite consistent.
Sure.
But it always kind of comes back. Yeah, so there was some musical theater happening at U of Kansas. It's also a big opera school.
Mm,
Um, again, the weird thing, I love University of Kansas. It's a great composition program. It's a great vocal program. It's just always hard at the graduate school level to do two things.
Right.
Very difficult. So I was involved in the opera department just a little bit my second year.
Okay.
I was in the chorus for Riders to the Sea, and I took lessons, voice lessons from a wonderful TA, and then my second year at U of Kansas from one of the faculty members, Julia Broxholm, who is fabulous.
Julia
But it kind of,
Broxel?
Julia Broxholm,
Holm.
yeah.
Broxholm.
Hmm.
Okay. Um, so you've then had like always had a mix of like the
Yeah.
classical side and the more contemporary musical theater side and opera, and it's all kind of
Yeah. And I think
smooshing
like
together.
I don't necessarily have like contemporary musical theater like pop rock stuff. And
Gotcha.
Lewis and Clark is a very like it is a program that's mostly straight theater. I mean non-musical. Sometimes people call that
Mm,
like straight
mm,
theater.
gotcha.
So they only did one musical while I was there, and ironically it overlapped with my very last semester when I was doing two senior recitals and a senior theater project of all. So I was not a part of that musical, and that the timing of that seemed very you know, I don't know, very ironic to me at the
Mm,
time. And at the same time, there was nothing, I was so excited to get to put on these events that you'd
hmm.
kind of been building up to that it really wasn't that big of a sense of loss to me because I just knew there was no way I could add anything on top of that, you
Yeah,
know.
yeah, for
So
sure.
so I let it go, and everyone was wonderful. They did You're in Town. It was hilarious, and I had fun watching my friends. And then I went back and rapidly practiced and composed and all the other things. Yeah, but I wouldn't say like my training in theater is mostly like the acting was very much separate from the singing.
Gotcha.
And um I love to combine them, but I definitely like not the I don't have the pop rock like contemporary training in the same way that I had like the legit golden era of classical
I see.
musical theater. That's kind of where my voice has more of the technique right now. Maybe someday that will change.
Okay. So not so much the Andrew Lloyd Webber side, uh, maybe a little
Even
bit.
Andrew Lloyd Webber is
Still
pretty much still.
okay.
I guess it depends on the show,
Mm,
and then it gets all involved in these kind of crazy things about voice types and belter versus legit, and whether that means legit is soprano or not.
gotcha.
But I guess like if you think about like pop rock musical theater, that's
I
not
see.
something that I have extensive training in at
Gotcha.
this
Gotcha.
time, you know. But if you go back to Rodgers and Hammerstein, Lerner and Lowe, those kind of golden age of musical theater, that's the kind of technique that I studied.
Okay.
Mhm.
And I guess I'm trying to because musical theaters in general, like opera and the more recent kind of musical theaters, not something I'm hugely well versed in.
Sure.
Um, but you do opera-ish stuff as well.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Yeah. Um, and how do those two, they're pretty different sounds to my ears.
Yeah. They are different sounds.
And, I'm thinking of like, they're sometimes polyglots will say like when they go to a country, it takes them a few days to get into the language. And then when they
Hmm.
come back home, it takes them a few days to get back.
Hmm.
Like is it hard for your brain to switch back and forth between those two styles, or is it not as compartmentalized?
No, I think you could say there's something similar. I mean, if you think about what's asked of you in classical, the classical style, consistent vibrato, consistent legato, sort of the chiaroscuro, the bright dark sound. That's
Mm,
kind of the mix of like the overtone projection, that where you get this kind of wah in your head resonance. That's a technical term, but you get like this resonance thing going on along with the depth thing, and mainly because of the sort of tradition of miking, a lot
mm,
more variety of sounds are possible once you're mic'd.
that makes total
And so
sense. Yeah.
as mics became things that were used in musical theater, this allows a lot more variety of sounds that you can make that wouldn't otherwise project.
Hmm.
So a musical theater has a different approach to vibrato, maybe more delayed vibrato, maybe different diction stuff. So I think you can totally, like, if you do a lot of it, you can kind of come back to your opera art and go like, oh, whoa, I got to remember to keep that vibrato going all the time. And then a lot of the time too, we might be asked like, hey, less vibrato, or no, less, more talky, less singy is a direction that is often given when you move into that musical theater space. But also, if you kind of look at the styles that I say I'm more comfortable in, which is like the golden age and legit, that's the time when they weren't mic'd as much originally. Rodgers and Hammerstein, you listen to Julie Andrews sing The Sound of Music, that's pretty much classical technique. Really not that different at all. So the farther you deviate from those, I think you can get into habits like anything else. Um, but as a voice teacher, I believe the voice can do many things. We can have many gears. I'm a triathlete. I can swim and bike and run, and I think the voice can do the same thing. It's kind of a matter of like, do you have the time to study each one? Do you have good coaches to help you figure out how to do each thing so that you know how to move into those different gears? And do you want to be switching between those? How does that fit with what you're working on? Yeah.
Okay. I also noticed on your biography, you have a number of pretty heavy classical rep that you've done. So like the Bach B minor Mass, Duraflé Requiem. I think I saw Foray on there. I can't remember all of them. There were a lot.
Ooh, there's a lot of things.
Yeah.
Yeah. I haven't done the whole Bach B minor. I think I did an excerpt of that.
Oh, okay.
Often the whole Bach B minor might be done by an even darker like contralto. But
Sure.
I've done the St. Matthew Passion and the St. John Passion solos.
Yeah.
Hmm.
So something I'm kind of curious about, because those aren't overtly theatrical pieces.
Hmm. Hmm.
And I mean, I guess you could make an argument they have theatrical elements to them because of the stories that they're telling.
Hmm.
Um, but how much of the theater element gets brought into your performances of not quite as theater-y stuff, like, or even down to like Lieder, right?
Hmm.
Kind of the classical art song,
Everything to
all
me
of it.
is yeah, I can't quite get into anything without, it's all storytelling, it's all
Mm,
communication. Now, there's different style, there's different movement. I've seen art songs staged in a way that I didn't think actually helped.
mm,
Like it's not necessarily that to do something and involve theater is to, it's not doesn't always mean that you're going to do a bunch of blocking, in my opinion. I think theater tells us that we're always communicating something. We always have a goal. We always want something. We're trying to get it. We're trying to communicate. We're in dialogue. That to me is theater. And I think oratorio absolutely has to feel that way. And actually, maybe even more so when you repeat the same three lines for 6 minutes. I mean, you
yeah.
have to, yes, of course, there's a suspension of reality when anybody starts singing on stage. It's not like a realistic television show where we sort of, most television to be in the style of realism or melodrama. That's the style of acting that we're the most familiar with as American audiences. There's many styles of acting. It's not only realistic kinds of acting or kind of intensified realistic kinds of acting, which would be like melodrama, where we kind of have a little heightened emotion. That's very common in our television and movies, which is how most of us encounter acting on a daily basis. Um, so where was I going with that? So there's first of all, there's many styles, So if I do a piece that is like a contemporary music piece that's kind of maybe very avant-garde and doesn't really seem to have a story, you can still approach that with theater because theater is about doing, theater is about communicating, theater is about making bold choices and doing that thing and being really comfortable doing that thing.
Yeah.
If you're talking about oratorio, it often means like being very comfortable standing and being in that space of standing and communicating something and of shaping in subtle ways. It's not just that erbarmedi is sad for 6 minutes. That's too simple. It's got to be specific. There's got to be variety. And finding that variety within the style of singing Bach with your eye on the conductor, yeah, that's pretty subtle. But I think there's a big difference between every time you sing that phrase, having a specific intention that changes, of deciding whether you're actually speaking and looking directly at the audience or you're choosing to address an unseen entity versus having wandery eye syndrome and not knowing exactly which of those you've chosen, which is something that a lot of younger singers can fall into when they're first trying to get their hands around this, because it's a huge task and it's a ton of music. So yeah, so theater to me is a lens of approaching everything that I do, but it's not one size fits all. Yeah.
That's totally fair.
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So you got your DMA at University of Iowa,
Mm-hmm.
and I actually found that I could download your thesis.
Oh, no way, cool.
Yeah. I didn't
You're one
read
of the
it.
ones I got in my report. I get an email once a month.
Nice. I didn't read it because it's 300 pages long.
That's okay.
But I did read the abstract, and you wrote about composer Gabriela Lena Frank,
Mm-hmm.
who you met at University of Kansas.
Yeah, she was a guest. She came as a guest composer. Yeah.
Okay. Was that for an extended time, or is that like a
Gosh, I think it was like a day.
A day.
Or maybe two. Must have been like maybe there was a few days because I feel like the one of the ensembles or more was performing some of her stuff.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Okay.
So so I met her first there, and then a couple of years later, I was at the Cortona sessions for New Music as a singer, which is a kind of a artist retreat style festival for new music composers and performers to have this really loving, safe space to experiment and grow and drink wine and enjoy beauty and create together. And she's on faculty there. And
Okay.
so we met again there, or we connected there, and I sing her cycle Cuatro Canciones Andinas on one of my doctoral recitals.
Gotcha.
Mm-hmm.
What was it like writing a thesis on somebody who is still alive?
It was awesome. I highly recommend it. That was actually one of my criteria when I was thinking about what to write about was that I really did not want to write about something that had been written about a lot before. I didn't think that that would be as helpful or as useful. Where really what I was able to offer by writing about Gabriela's music, because she's so generous and open-hearted and giving of her time and herself, was that in addition to my thoughts and analysis of the music and the text, I got to call her and have her talk to me about these pieces. And this was so helpful to me as a performer to get more insights. It was so inspiring. And it was also so wonderful as a composer to understand some of the things that inspire her and that have led her down this path of the work she's explored and how she thinks about composition and how she thinks about orchestration and how she chooses texts and stories. And so I felt like I knew I wanted to write about someone living. I knew I didn't want to have a lit review where I was going to have to thread the needle between a bunch of experts, as sort of someone newer to this kind of scholarship. That sounded like a lot of headache and tearing my hair out just to try to claim some tiny piece of space that didn't seem very useful. And also as a contemporary music singer, contemporary music composer. Yeah, I knew it would only work if I had somebody who was going to be super excited about that and open. And she was so wonderful. She gave me access to some non-commercially released recordings to help with my analysis because some of the works had not been commercially recorded, or at least hadn't been at the time. And access to scores and just interviews with her. And she was also so loving and kind about don't just write what I say, write what you think. She was so trusting, and I really appreciated that.
Yeah, I guess I can kind of see you might want to know the person you're writing about on some level, it's easy to imagine that could go a different direction with a person who has a
Yeah.
different personality.
Yeah, or just you might not be able to have access to things. I mean, I
Mm,
had when I was thinking about different ideas and different composers that I might want to focus on, and you know, one of the pieces that I was looking at, oh gosh, I can't remember who it was by, but anyway, my professor was like, "Why don't you write about such and such?" And I said, "Well, I don't know them. There's no recording. I can't even begin to make an analysis of this piece if I'm trying to pluck out of a chamber score on the piano." I mean, it just from a practical standpoint, and I really think pretty practically when it comes to starting to define a big project like a dissertation. I really didn't want that to become some horrendous task of me paying people to make a realization of a score just so I could analyze what I thought was happening, you know. And you can't just analyze music, in my opinion, by looking at the score. You have to hear it. You're letting go of so much that your imagination can't can't put in for you, you know.
yeah, that's fair. Um, Sorry, it was on the tip of my tongue. I just lost
No, you're
it.
fine.
um, so these songs and even the composer herself, you mentioned that you're a little surprised your teachers, your professors hadn't heard of her as a
Yeah.
vocalist, maybe,
Hmm.
and that a lot of the works on her like sort of spotlight bio from Shot Publishing, I think,
Oh, I think
were
it's Shermer. I think it's
Shermer.
Shermer.
Okay,
Hmm.
were instrumental.
Hmm.
Um, have you found that maybe in contemporary classical music, there's a slant more towards the instrumental as opposed to the vocal? Like,
Yes.
okay.
Yeah. Yeah, totally. 100%. I mean, it's getting better in some areas. I mean, our theory books, our theory curriculum, our music history curriculum, it's not just contemporary. You
Hmm,
know, once you're out of the Renaissance, you're lucky if they talk about anything vocal, you know?
that's true, actually, now that you
Yeah, it
mention
is
it.
true, actually, as it turns out. And so it's actually really strange to me because I remember in theory class and stuff, we'd have to choose pieces to analyze and, things like that. And when I go back now and I look at art songs that I'm assigning my students, I think this is exactly that form thing that people were talking about. Why didn't we look at some of these art songs for examples of
Hmm.
different phrase forms and for examples of do you want like an obvious examples of like the most common modulations ever? You go to Gilbert and Sullivan, and
Yeah,
it's like how helpful would it have been not just to the singers in the class, but just to everyone to get to see some examples in tonal theory of like really obvious. This is how it's like when you go and you read church hymns and you go, that's all the part writing stuff they were talking about. And for
yeah,
some reason, these silly books, these textbooks, they jump right into like the most difficult exceptions to the rule in the most thorny Beethoven string quartet ever, instead of letting undergrads like see like five examples that are super obvious. So anyway, there's my soapbox. Yeah, I mean, look, I've had like so many great experiences with wonderful composers and performers who absolutely take singers totally seriously, and it is fabulous. But there's definitely a feeling that if you're a singer in new music, you better have perfect pitch. And if you
hmm,
don't, you're dumb.
okay,
That is definitely a thing. And especially if you're talking about new music that values like very crunchy sonorities or pointillistic things where the pitches are sort of coming in and not necessarily being traditionally related to each other.
hmm,
These are things that are very difficult sometimes for non-perfect pitch singers to do
yeah,
because we don't have buttons. And so again, if that's kind of one of the genres or one of the aesthetics that's like being elevated, then that is also an aesthetic that's a lot easier to do on a piano, as it turns out, right? It's a lot easier to have success with certain instruments at that, and not with singing or and probably other certain instruments that find that more difficult. But I mean, yeah, there's a bias, absolutely. Yeah,
yeah,
yeah.
it's interesting what you brought up about using vocal music as examples or the lack of
Mhm.
examples of vocal music, because I think like I always appreciated like Webern who's
Mm-hmm.
almost the epitome of the thorny composer for a lot of people.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, sure.
um, and I remember like actually going, what are his songs
Mm-hmm.
and what text did he pick? And actually reading the texts. And then when I went back to his Sinfonia, I was like, oh, I get what he's expressing because I have the text. Like there's a literal,
Mm-hmm.
you know, concrete sort of imagery that he has in
Yeah.
mind underpinning his music.
That's a nice way into something sometimes too. If a style is something that might be a little harder to relate to at first, or if a composer, yeah, it can be really wonderful to have text or a program or something, it's not the only way, but I think it can be a really great way, especially if you're talking about, maybe somebody, an audience that you want to reach that hasn't maybe heard that recently.
Yeah. Um, so kind of pivoting more towards your own compositions.
Hmm.
You've written a chamber opera,
Yeah.
right? White
Yes.
Horizon.
Hmm.
Um, what were the circumstances that brought this about? And was it like where was it done? I
Sure.
guess.
Yeah, it was done at the University of Kansas.
Mm.
So University of Kansas has a fabulous student performing new music ensemble, Helianthus, that is organized by Forrest Pierce, who is one of my mentors and was the reason I went to University of Kansas to study with him. And what he did was he took one of the semesters for Helianthus while I was there, and that was going to be the semester that they performed new chamber operas by several of the composers who were studying at U of Kansas at the time. So what we did is in the fall semester, we wrote our pieces. We were matched up with people who signed up to be in the class to do this project in the spring semester. So we wrote specifically for those people. And then in the spring semester, we did musical rehearsals, staging rehearsals, and then performances of the chamber operas. And so I I wrote for two of my colleagues as the singers, and then a quartet of instruments and a fabulous conductor. And then I actually performed in a colleague's own chamber opera as well. So yeah,
I do have that down. Was that Lee Kai Han, Nightingale and the
yeah, Lee
Rose?
Kai-han Jeremiah was the
Jeremiah.
Nightingale and the Rose was beautiful. Yeah, really cool
Um,
piece.
how was your experience working on those smaller, very small theatrical works,
It was so
different from
great.
the large kind of full scale productions that you've been parts of?
What I think is really neat about chamber opera and where I draw a parallel to like black box theater
Hmm.
is that chamber opera really lets everyone be on the same playing field. Oftentimes, you're not even performing with a pit, and you don't need to
Mm-hmm.
because the ensemble's small enough where you don't have to have that acoustic kind of uh, a little bit of that acoustic muffling, I guess, or that's probably the wrong word. But sometimes if the orchestra was actually on stage with the singers, you couldn't see them, and also the brass might kind of blow out the singers. Sometimes depending on the acoustics of the hall. So what's great about chamber music is there's ideas of balance, of collaboration, of really like looking your fellow ensemble members in the eye during those music rehearsals is so much more fun and collaborative. And you also get to be really creative about using your space. We staged these in 3/4. So we were able to put like audience on three sides, and then there was just one kind of backdrop. And that also made it very interesting to set up the space, to set up where people were going to move. The minute you're doing 3/4, you have to move in a completely different way as an actor because no matter where you're pointed, someone's kind of looking at the rear side of you. So you have to move in a different way to kind of give the love and work the corners. And it's really interesting. And audiences love kind of they can kind of see each other's reactions. And yeah, it was a really, really neat project. And it's a model I keep going back to in my dreams of what I would love to create um, and how I can make that happen.
It's kind of an uncommon genre. Are there other people? Is this like percolating around in the background and is just kind of waiting for its time in the sun, or is this
I
kind of still
think there are
undeveloped?
many companies. They're like, if you kind of look up indie opera, there's like
Hmm.
some Facebook groups and you go around, there's quite a few small opera companies doing really innovative, neat things with new works, with staging differently older works. There's a lot of them on the East Coast, and then there's a smattering of them in other places. I mean, we have Opera Theater Oregon here, based in Portland, that does unusual, smaller works sometimes, or the Little Prince isn't necessarily a smaller work, but they did it, kind of in an intimate space. Um, and Renegade Opera, which is a new company that's getting started up, and they're doing, well, they were supposed to do this summer, they were supposed to do a Clemenza di Tito staged in a really unique way, and I think that's being pushed because of the pandemic. So I do think there's a lot of this going on in little places, and then in between, there's kind of these places where we're not seeing it in every city yet. And like any small company, it's really challenging. I mean, opera is really time consuming, even on a small scale, and it's very expensive even on a small scale. So you have to figure out how you're going to do that. I think it can be a real passion project, and you have to have a good team behind you, which is kind of another reason why I keep having ideas, and I haven't quite figured out how to make it happen yet, but I have schemes. I love to
Yeah.
scheme. So
It's
yeah,
interesting the comment about cost, because I think my assumption, and probably the assumption of most people, is that this would be a fairly cost effective way of moving forward. But I think it just sort of goes to show how expensive opera as a genre
sure.
is.
Yeah, and I think like if you talk about like a chamber ensemble, maybe that doesn't memorize things
Mm-hmm.
and doesn't have to do staging, doesn't have lights or costumes, and doesn't maybe need the same staging space needs, even if you stage things, and you still usually want some kind of like entrance and exits and
Yeah.
things like that. And opera, even chamber opera, often has a conductor that can often be helpful depending on the music, especially if it's contemporary. It may really require a conductor. So you need to have kind of a space for the conductor, a space for the singers. They have to be able to see. The singers have to be memorized, and you're going to have to do musical rehearsals and staging rehearsals, usually with a rehearsal pianist, and then have your time when everybody gets together and you run it a few times. So like it's a much more involved process than a chamber music concert. And anytime you have to memorize things and anytime you have to stage things, it takes more time. But yes, absolutely, it's way more affordable than grand opera. But I think grand opera companies, they don't want to let go of that. I mean, they exist, like a symphony doesn't want to become a string quartet. It's a beautiful genre in and of itself. And also there are people who are writing new, wonderful new grand operas, and we want to see those on those big stages too. So I think it's like a both and for me.
Gotcha.
And you definitely see like Portland Opera's done a few kind of smaller chamber productions over the last few years, and maybe even before then, but where they've done things kind of in a black box setting that are sort of smaller productions, and that's really cool to see them do these hybrid, you know,
Yeah.
seasons. It's super exciting. I love it.
Oh, very nice. So getting even smaller, you
Hmm.
have you call it the One Voice Project.
Yeah.
And can you describe what the project is? It's about unaccompanied voice. And what exactly are the goals of the project? Or is this just like an overarching name for something like a general approach to writing for voice?
Yeah, so the One Voice Project is, the goal of it is to expand the repertoire for unaccompanied voice, and also to advocate for unaccompanied
Hmm.
singing as a completely wonderful genre to write for and to sing in, the same way that we have unaccompanied instrumental music for just about every single instrument ever.
Hmm.
And we don't have that repertoire as part of our normal practice in classical music. Although certainly once you go digging, there are many pieces that exist, but they are not taught
Hmm.
Nobody has to do an unaccompanied piece at any point in any recital ever. And I doubt as a cellist that is true for you,
No, yeah, I mean, the Bach is part of the audition process.
right? Yeah, yeah. So this came out of a few things. The same Lee Kai-han Jeremiah who wrote Nightingale and the Rose wrote these beautiful Japanese haiku settings that were really gorgeous that I performed at University of Kansas and also at the Cortona sessions for new music. And they were scary to do unaccompanied. You get to the end of the piece, you're half stuff off, you know it's completely your fault. It's not because the pianist wasn't there that day. So it like challenges you in this different way that like I'm sure all of you instrumentalists who work on
Hmm.
unaccompanied stuff have to, oh, my intonation, or oh, that rhythm thing, or oh shoot,
It's
all
very
those,
exposed.
you're very exposed. So on the one hand, it was this huge challenge, and kind of nerding out and geeking out about that was exciting and overwhelming and cool. And then at the other hand, it was so amazing to sing something on my own and feel like it was complete. Because maybe you've also had this experience of going home for the holidays and your family asks you to play something.
Mm,
And in my case, it would be me singing art song, and you sort of have this thing like, okay, do I just skip the interlude?
right.
How do I, oh, let me go get my new note. It feels like super awkward because it is awkward to do something without half of it,
Hmm.
right? I mean,
Hmm.
the music doesn't exist, just the solo line. The piano part is so, so important in art song. The piano part is so, so important in any instrument plus piano combo. It's not solo, it's a duet. It's really a duet,
Right.
100%. So it was really exciting. And so then I went, why don't we have more of this? And why don't we do more of this? And one place where we do have that tradition would be many of our folk songs
Hmm.
are often have a tradition of where people would sing them unaccompanied. Maybe they're labor songs that they would do in the field, or they would sing them and improvise or whatever. So that's another source of inspiration to me. And I sang some unaccompanied Irish folk songs as well as some other unaccompanied pieces on a concert in Iowa with a friend of mine, Timothy Sue, who's a violinist. So we did like some solos and some duets. And then I put out this call for scores. So the One Voice project kind of got kicked off then with a call for scores. And of those, I selected some winning works that were performed several times in Iowa, and then subsets have been performed in many different venues at New Music Gathering in Boston. Uh, some of them actually were on my Third Angle concert last month. They have become a repertoire that I can pull from and I sort of add to now a little bit more organically recently, sort of one piece at a time, more by invitation. Back when I did it in 2014, the call, Twitter was still pretty new. And I think I got maybe 45 submissions, some from people I knew, some from people I didn't. Now, I think if I put out a call, I would be not able to like sort through all of them because my network is so much larger, and I don't think it would be very fair to people, especially if maybe they were writing something new. So I've been rethinking that as I move forward, is how can I, now that I'm lucky enough to know more people who want to write for me, how can I use that most usefully to ask specific people to write, or to notice somebody has a piece in their repertoire that I want to add to mine that they've already written that needs a second performance, and things like that. And then recently I've written some more pieces for unaccompanied voice. So I was invited to write a piece for Arwen Myers, who's a fabulous soprano here in Portland, for her Artslandia concert back in April. And so I wrote Strawberry Man, which is a short song for singer accompanying with a little bit of claps and stomps. And I just wrote a piece for Rhymes with Opera's Pocket Opera workshop that's happening next week. And that's a 3-minute micro unaccompanied opera. And so that'll be workshop next week, and is getting my gears going for some other mini unaccompanied projects that I think could be very, very impactful given that we're all in our homes during this quarantine.
For sure.
Mm-hmm.
And speaking of your own compositions now, I think the one that I heard was at the Cascadia composers presentation you gave. It was American Waters,
Oh, great.
right?
Yeah.
And then I was just looking through some of the titles of your other works. So like Twister, Icy, Celestial Bodies, Thaw is very nature inspired. And
Mhm.
um, I was curious where that inspiration is coming from. Are they
Mhm.
like coming from poetic texts, or is it just a general love of nature and the beauty and sublimity of it all?
Yeah, so for me as a composer, I find maybe this is because I'm a singer and actress that I really need to have an image or a concept or a theme, something somewhat, even if it's loosely programmatic, that's when ideas flow. That's when I come into artistic flow.
Hmm.
And maybe that will change, but I did an experiment a few years ago, maybe even last year, where I sort of tried instead to just think about things purely like, let's write some motives, and
Mm-hmm.
much more abstract kind of. And it was an interesting experiment. It did not unlock my creativity the same way that once I start to try to write about a gulper eel, suddenly all kinds of cool stuff comes out that I'm feeling is useful and interesting and that clarinetists like to play. And so, yeah, so that's kind of the first thing is for me, finding what I want to talk about, finding an inspiration, an image, a concept, a critter or a landscape or something. And I'm somebody who, for me, like nature, going out in the world, encountering plants and animals and mountains is really, it's a very spiritual thing. It's a place where I feel connected and sort of comforted by the fact that I'm not alone in being a living creature that has like a beginning, middle, end. There's something elemental. I feel also like a kinship and like a great deal of empathy. I'm a vegan and I feel this empathy since I was a little kid, always with just like every little tiny critter and plant and just feeling like they deserve to have their shot and live and I love that empathy and also I feel a sense of the alien that I don't ever really know what their existence is like and that's kind of cool and then with natural phenomena I without making light of like I know like tornadoes can be horrible. I don't want to make light of that or volcanic explosions, but when I think about natural phenomenon, I think about how we humans have done a lot to our earth that maybe the earth is not so happy about and that we feel very in control and like it's our right to be in control. And then I look at like Mount St. Helens and like Mount St. Helens just decided to blow up and there was nothing we could do about it. And it's awful that it hurt people. I feel an odd sense of like comfort that we can't completely destroy the earth. you know
Yeah,
and I
yeah.
also feel I think kind of somewhat of a spiritual like connection that there's something that's sitting there and it's going to be there when I'm gone and it's existing on its own plane and these things to me are very interesting to try to express through music in some way the some little bit of appreciation of wondering of my place in it all, of its place in its own thing, and how little my place in it all matters to the mountain or to the tornado or to the gulper eel. And I hope that is an invitation to audience members to sit in space. I think our art form it unfolds over time. And so what do we give our audiences? We give them time to sit with something. And you're gonna get to sit in something in a sound world and I hope it can be an invitation to sit in that sound world and see what comes up for you and maybe look at that mountain differently or go look up that goofy weird gulper eel and see what it's all about and feel a sense of maybe comfort and also maybe a sense of challenge to protect and to appreciate. So yeah.
Yeah. Coming down from the mountain, though, uh, you have a keen interest in gender representation in music,
Yeah.
historically, contemporarily, for composers. You know, when I was thinking about this for our interview, I was kind of like, it's a different world in like opera and voice, because I was just remembering, I had to look it up, like the Vienna Philharmonic, the first time they had a woman in their orchestra at all was like 1997,
It's terrible.
right?
Yeah.
Um, and but like then in the world of voice, the prima donna, what would you call it, phenomenon, I
Yeah,
guess,
sure. Yeah, probably.
yeah, is has been a thing for a very long time.
Mm-hmm.
um and you know, the thing that sort of kicked off a thought line for me, I saw in your DMA thesis, you had a book Michael K. Slayton
Mm-hmm.
wrote called Women of Influence in Contemporary Music. And I had the thought that, you know, thinking historically, I knew I could think of a lot of women who had influence, but not a lot of women who had power. Does
Hmm.
that
Mm-hmm.
distinction make sense to you? Because I'm like, well, we've got like Queen Elizabeth,
Sure.
Catherine the Great, you know, maybe some others.
Yeah,
Um,
that's interesting. Yeah, I mean, I think for sure there's like it's difficult for us to look back and go how much of it is erasure and how much of it is like limiting in that moment. You know what I mean? Because
mm,
I think the historical gaze backwards means that sometimes maybe people who were more influential got erased or their influence has been diminished in how we talk about them. You
mm-hmm,
know, because it's a choice to keep talking about whatever Beethoven or to talk about Robert Schumann and then mention Clara as a footnote versus the other way around. And we'd
mm-hmm.
have to, I would have to be a better musicologist or I'd have a time
Sure.
machine to know for sure. But yeah, I do think that women, I can even just look at my own life and I can think of the huge influence and the huge impact that women around me have. And then the thing is that institutionally the power still is often held not by women, right?
Mm,
And so whereas like a mentor one-on-one can have an amazing impact on somebody's life and on what they go on to do, you know, the impact of women working in the home, you know, is huge impact for hundreds of years of our society, thousands of years of our society. You can't say that's not an impact
mm-hmm.
to raise children or whatever, but were they given the same rights, the same powers? Were they? Yeah, I think that's an interesting lens. I think there's probably a good amount
Sure.
of truth to that.
What about your view of gender from within the world of vocal music and
Mm.
vocal theater?
It's
Or,
super problematic. It's so problematic. So there's so many, if you go to like opera and theater, there's so much typecasting
mm,
by gender, and there's so much heteronormativity and, you know, erasure of LGBTQ, you know, there's just a huge erasure. And it hurts everybody. You know, it
mm,
hurts everybody. It hurts the soprano friends of mine who are so sick of singing the damsel in distress, and it hurts my baritone friend who's sick of being the sleazy old guy. I mean, it
yeah.
hurts everybody. Yeah, and it certainly hurts. It hurts people who don't feel like there's a place for them at all. Most of all, right? It hurts people who feel like they don't ever get to be authentic on stage. Most of all, right? So that's a huge problem, and our associations with different voice colors, with different gender and different characters, that stereotypical kind of casting is it's going to be really hard to unprogram, but we have to start doing it. We just have to. Because just because your voice is low doesn't mean you're the bad guy. Just because your voice is low doesn't mean that you're going to present as male, you know? And just because your voice is high doesn't mean you're going to present as female, you know, or that that your identity is female and not even present. I mean, that doesn't mean that your identity is a woman. Your identity is it can be many things, and that's not tied only to the pitches that you sing. So this is a challenge. It's a huge problem. I'm probably making all kinds of mistakes in how I describe it right now, but I'm forging ahead and doing the best I can. Queer opera was a really wonderful experience that I was a part of last fall. That's a project that is being put on by Chuck Dillard and his team at based in Portland University, Portland State. And I performed with that ensemble. My part was as an ally. It was really, really interesting. We did like scenes from standard repertoire, but we staged them to reflect a broad diversity of gender identities and expressions. And it was by and far like some of the most impactful work I've ever done, some of the most meaningful theater making I've ever done. Many of the singers are really talented undergrads and recent grads of Portland State. And they were so expressive. They were so sharing of their talents. And it meant so much to all of us to be part of that. So I think that's a model. And I think there are some other really wonderful models for breaking that down, and a lot of times for uplifting another voice and stepping back and shutting up, you know, and that includes me as well. And then also we just need more women on stage as well. I mean, we need more women's roles. There's so many really wonderful sopranos and mezzos, and there's many wonderful basses and tenors, but there's not as many of them. And just, you could hire 10 wonderful sopranos for every tenor, and probably still have a bunch of sopranos in the city who don't have work, and that's stupid. It's extremely frustrating, and it's perpetuated every time someone writes another opera that's Billy Budd or Moby Dick, or I mean, it doesn't fit the demographics of who's available to sing, and it perpetuates this problem that you have all these talented people who want work, and you're just making them have a harder shot instead of being like, sweet, look at all these awesome sopranos and mezzos, let's write for them. As well as, I mean, I wrote Wide Horizon for tenor and baritone. It doesn't mean you don't ever get, like, all of that, right? It's like, it doesn't mean you don't ever get to write for any of that stuff, but like, yeah. And there's some really wonderful articles on New Music Box and some other publications about how to make vocal writing in classical music, like how to write music and market your music so that it's more open to many different singers, you know, talking about ranges instead of talking about voice types, sort of addressing different ways that we can think about and disconnect our gendered ideas from voice typing. And that's something that I've really been thinking about as well, and trying to update on my website vocal range versus voice type as much as I can, or include both at least, you know, and try to be really clear and upfront with language that, you know, if you would like to sing this piece down the octave or up the octave, you're welcome to, you know, so that I still think for now we're in this thing where many sopranos want to quickly scan and see what do you have for them. Many tenors want to scan what they have, you know, do you have anything for tenor? Maybe someday that will change, but I think if one can say, you know, mezzo soprano or anyone with this range, you know, if that's a piece that you would like to make available, and if it's a piece you really feel has to be sung by someone of a specific identity, then you can have that, of course. But yeah, it's a big thing. We have to work on it. We just have to.
Well, I'm looking at the time. We should probably wrap this up. But the last question, on the count of three, first composer that pops into your head, 3, 2, 1, go.
Benjamin Britten.
Okay, what brought Benjamin Britten to your head?
Curlew River.
Okay.
It's so awesome.
Yeah, it's a cool piece.
So when I said I want to write chamber opera, Forrest Pierce said, why don't you listen to Curlew River? And I went and got the score in the CD. It was back in the CDs, and I had like one of those CD players, you know, that like, it was like a portable CD player. And I sat down with the score, and you know, like we do score listening, and sometimes you're like kind of making yourself do it. Like you're glad, but it's kind of work. And like, I was so captivated. I couldn't stop. I was so like, it's really creepy and weird. It's a weird story. And the instrument grouping is so unique, and there's so many interesting sounds. And I couldn't stop. like I had to keep going the whole show. And I love it. And I think there's something so interesting too. He combines this sort of Japanese no theater with, and this was just on the recording, but that does influence some of his instrumental choices.
Hmm.
So he combines that with this sort of morality play format of like the whole cast walking on stage and chanting and proclaiming that they're about to tell this story. And it's really, I mean, I was always been kind of a fantasy and Middle Ages geek, and I loved that. And yeah, I actually I gotta dig in. I don't know if Benjamin Britten ever said anything about a gender swapped version of those. I don't even know if anyone does those shows in America. I would love to do a gender flipped Curlew River. I would love to do it with a cast of all women. I think it would be wonderful and super cool. And I don't think anyone has done it, or if they have, it's been a while. So why not do it again? So yeah, that's
Okay,
yeah.
cool. All right. Well, thanks for joining me today. It's been wonderful
No, you're so welcome.
talking with you and hearing your experience. And yeah, I really appreciate it.
Oh, thanks for having me on. I really appreciate your time too. Thanks for asking me.